And where's the microphone?
There.
Sitting there, you can't see.
So that's there. So this is what this hearing, this hearing broadcast out.
How you doing?
Good, how are you?
Okay. A little tired.
So you were live on.
I walked 3 blocks.
Hmm?
I walked 3 blocks.
So you can say you're ready. Cable TV will be left there.
Oh, it's 3:06. Okay. All right. Am I waiting?
No.
Are you waiting for me?
Cable TV.
That's a mistake. Let's get started then. I do a press conference before the council has its legislative meetings, but also tomorrow's legislative meeting concerns the council's consideration of the fiscal year 2022 budget and the financial plan. It's a 4-year financial plan. So this press conference is a little later than usual, and it's also more substantive with regard to what's happening with the budget. Let me begin by talking about the process. The mayor sent down the budget in May. The council has 70 days under the Home Rule Act to act on the budget. We're required to vote twice. So the first vote will be tomorrow, which is roughly the 56th day since we got the budget. The council committees were all asked to comment on the portions of the budget that concerned the agencies under their jurisdiction. During the month of June, all of the council committees held hearings, got input from the public, looked at what those agency budgets were, and adopted reports at the end of June that made recommendations with regard to the agency budgets. The Committee of the Whole, which I chair, looks at all of those committee reports, looks at the budget comprehensively, and then puts together a committee print, a draft report, which is what will be circulated shortly, and what the council will be considering tomorrow. The budget is approximately $17.5 billion. That includes the federal funding that we've received through some of it through the ordinary course of federal programs, but also much of it from the relief acts that Congress has passed over the past year. If I remember correctly, that's over $3 billion in federal relief money. A number of council members have suggested that given the unique circumstances of this budget, the large infusion of federal money, that we ought to be looking at transformational opportunities with this budget. And I agree with that approach. And so there are a number of provisions in the budget that I'm circulating for the council's consideration that will be, in my view, transformational. That is, will have a long-term effect, beneficial effect on people's lives or on business activity or quality of life in the city. To give you an example, with the budget that is being circulated, we will be voting on funding baby bond legislation. I think it has a longer, less interesting name. Baby bonds are a concept where if it's targeted for low-income individuals, which this legislation is, in fact, it's individuals who are in families at 300% or below federal poverty guidelines, then the city will be depositing up to $1,000 per year for each of these individuals from birth until they're 18. So think about it. When a kid who lives in the district, you have to live in the district, turns 18, instead of being like most kids where they don't really have any money and they're done with high school and they're out, what are they going to do? These kids will have $18,000 possibly more if it benefits from accrued interest. The idea is that this is a way that we can help with wealth building among those who come from or born into poverty, and maybe changing the equity equation in the district. I think that's transformational. We're adding about almost $11 million to what the mayor proposed for the Access to Justice Initiative, for a total of almost $23 million in next year's budget. Access to justice is a fancy way of saying civil legal services. And where this can be transformational is that by providing attorney representation to indigent clients, such as in landlord-tenant court, where over 90% of tenants are without legal representation, can be a game changer in the ability of low-income folks to stay in their homes and avoid eviction, or to be able to access federal benefits like SNAP or SSI when they are initially denied. They don't know what to do, but with attorney assistance, they can get the benefits that they're entitled to. With the budget, we will be funding the Deputy Auditor for Public Safety. There will be separate legislation that will follow, but this is a recommendation of the Police Reform Commission, and it is a major step in improving accountability for policing in this city. We will be considering and approving tomorrow with the budget several pipelines to jobs programs, primarily through the University of the District of Columbia, including an Amazon Web Services pipeline, a nursing pipeline, an IT pipeline. So for example, a young adult, it's not age limited, it could be an old adult, somebody who wants a job in nursing can get into the pipeline to these new programs at UDC and have a career at the end. The other pipeline is a teacher pipeline to try to recruit more local residents to become teachers, recruit and train to teach, to certificate or to get a degree to be a teacher. With regard to quality of life, we're funding the Department of Buildings Act, which has been much talked about in recent weeks because of the disaster on Kennedy Street. This would break up the current Department of Consumer and Regulatory Affairs, create a new Department of Buildings, which will be focused on housing code and construction code compliance, and has the potential to reshape through code compliance, quality of life in the city. We are also expanding universal paid leave. When we adopted that a few years ago, there was 8 weeks for, it was 8, 6, and 2 for, if I remember correctly, 8 weeks for parental leave, 6 weeks for family care, and 2 weeks for medical leave or self-care. We're increasing that on a temporary basis, the medical or self-care to 6 weeks, from 2 weeks to 6 weeks, and are laying a path toward getting to 12, 12, and 12 weeks for new parent, family care, and self-care. That could be significant in improving quality of life for workers in the District of Columbia. We'll be funding the GAIN Act. Don't ask me what GAIN stands for because it's an acronym, but it is legislation that will follow, introduced by Councilmember Robert White, that would pay housing providers to convert existing rental units into affordable units using covenants on the property. The reason why this is significant is it's a new approach toward affordable housing. It is taking existing housing and converting it, if you will, into affordable housing. Yes, there's a cost to it, but the cost is less than new construction, and there isn't a delay of waiting for new construction. This is not replacing programs such as the Housing Production Trust Fund, in which we are sustaining the mayor's proposal for $400 million over 2 years in the Housing Production Trust Fund. This is an additional program, and I think could make quite a difference in getting more quickly to our goal of having more affordable units in the city. We're also establishing a re-entry housing program through the nonprofit Jubilee Housing. We believe it's the first of its kind in the country. except short-term housing for returning citizens with wraparound services. The two greatest barriers to returning citizens re-entering society as productive members is jobs and housing. Well, this is a strategy to deal with the housing problem, the housing part of that problem. And then we also are in the capital improvement plan, finally synchronizing and fully funding the reconstruction of the 8th Street Bridge, which may sound like that's not particularly transformational, but it will unlock the ability to redevelop Union Station and turn it into a 21st century multimodal hub for the East Coast, not just for the city, but actually for the East Coast. We're making substantial investments. And when I talk about investments, I'm now talking a little bit different than transformational. I'm talking about that which will produce an outcome, not just services, but something that actually is results in a product. Affordable housing. So the $400 million in Housing Production Trust Fund will result in additional affordable housing. And that's more money than we've ever put into the Housing Production Trust Fund. We're also putting $50 million, that includes what the mayor proposed, but additional to that, a total of $50 million for public housing repairs to see if we can't get back into use thousands of public housing units that currently sit vacant because they need repairs. Public education, the budget tomorrow will sustain the proposal for a 3.6% increase in the funding formula for schools and maintains the proposal for school modernization in the capital budget, but also funds the dyslexia bill, which is a bill that requires new strategies, additional training in our schools for teachers to recognize reading disorders and to better teach to help kids. Roughly 20% of students have a reading disorder, and most of them, that reading disorder is missed. And so that means they struggle with reading, and that means then that they struggle with learning and education. And if we could just recognize kids who've got reading disorders, and this may sound a little crazy, but in fact, it's not easily recognized. But with some training, teachers can recognize it. And if we can just recognize that and teach to learn to read those kids, it should make a significant difference in kids' ability to learn in our school system. We're also increasing out of school time by about 25%, adding $5 million for a total of $18.5 million for out of school, after school, before school programs. A few other big ticket items and what I'm presenting to the council is with childcare, there's about, I think it's about 100 million, maybe a little bit more than that, of subsidies that we provide to childcare facilities. But in addition, there's about $68 million in federal funding to improve childcare. And that includes a pay pilot that we're moving up from what the mayor had proposed. So it'll begin next year, not in 2023, to see if we can really to force increasing wages in the childcare sector. I had mentioned the repairs, $50 million repairs in public housing. There's $80 million in this budget to help businesses still struggling as a result of the shutdown last year due to the pandemic. That will be split between hotels and restaurants and small businesses. It's actually a total relief of about 88 million. We're adding 80 to what the mayor proposed, 80 to what the mayor proposed. Businesses are still struggling. They're reopening. It all looks good, but there's a lot of back rent that's owed. There's a lot of debt that many of these businesses have built up, and this is meant to help. It's also meant to help them get workers back more quickly. We are fully funding school-based mental health. There's been some debate about that. Every school will have a mental health professional, and that's especially important right now with the pandemic and the effect that it has had on many individuals' social emotional status. There's $35 million in the budget for undocumented and excluded workers. We're also exempting from income tax unemployment insurance. We're adding to the mayor's budget $20 million for permanent supportive housing. That's to reduce homelessness for individuals. And we're adding $5.5 million to the budget for emergency rental assistance to help more families and individuals from falling into homelessness because of emergency circumstances that impede their ability to pay rent. That's in addition to the $352 million that's currently available in federal dollars for rent and utility assistance to the Stay DC program. And finally, on my notes, I have here that we've added to the capital budget $25 million. This is working with the mayor to replace the fallen pedestrian bridge over Kenilworth Avenue. So those are the highlights of the budget. I briefed almost all of the members, and the documents will be circulating shortly. And my sense is that with regard to these issues that I've talked about in the funding, that there's a broad support in the council for this proposal. Council will meet tomorrow at noon, and I'm open to questions. That's my
How much was that for the Kenilworth Bridge?
25 million. And as you know, this is something that just happened. So I'm pleased that we were able to get them into the budget.
And then can you talk about where you found pockets of money for some of these proposals like baby bonds? Is that primarily from excess funds from the paid leave program?
Well, there are a number of sources that we looked at, but there was a considerable amount of reserve, a surplus in the universal paid leave account. And the mayor had proposed dividing most of it among in different ways. We didn't agree with her on most of that. So for example, there was a reduction in the tax rate. And a number of members said this really would benefit all businesses by reducing the tax rate temporarily. I have to emphasize temporarily, like for 3/4 of the year. And that really we ought to do something to help businesses in a more targeted way. Hence the $88 million that I mentioned.
And then how much is allocated for the deputy auditor for public safety?
I believe it's just under 2 million. I'm going to say like 1.7, but I think it's better to say almost 2 million.
Got it. And then when it comes to child care, there's no specific funding for birth to 3.
No, but there are two things that I'm recommending. One of them is what I said before, moving up that pilot, which has to do with increasing compensation for childcare workers. The other is that I have in the Budget Support Act, establishing a compensation task force so that we speed up looking at what the compensation should be. The challenge here is that the childcare workers almost uniformly get roughly minimum wage, and that's not good enough. In addition, if we recognize that birth to 3 is a period of significant learning and development by young people, I'm hesitating, what do I want to call them? They're not infants. Well, they start out as infants. If you recognize that, then you actually want some folks who are trained in educating birth to 3. I mean, when I was growing up, nobody thought about educating a 2-year-old, but actually they are learning and developing. And so having somebody who has training in early childcare can make a difference in that individual's life, that child's life, so that then when they go to pre-K, which we have in the city, universal pre-K, they actually are in a better place. And if they do well in pre-K, then when they get to kindergarten and K through 12, they're in an even better place. Long-term, if this is done right, public education is arguably the best jobs training program we have. And there is research to show that pre-K has a much higher result in better result in employment and even in higher education. So there are long-term benefits, significant long-term benefits. But if we're on the cheap with regard to early childcare, 0 to 3, if we're on the cheap, then we foreshorten that opportunity. So we want to improve the wages. We also, through birth to 3, are requiring more credentials, like a certificate or an associate's degree or a bachelor's degree, depends on your level. And so this all costs. The challenge is that we're not quite there, and there needs to be a compensation study that was in the original legislation. So that's what we're trying to do with the BSA, is to push that compensation, not the study that's already being done, but an analysis of what the compensation should be and how to get there. And then moving up the pilot, the compensation pilot that the mayor proposed starting in 2023, and we're going to start it next year. That was a long answer, but it speaks to the importance of childcare and what we're trying to do.
Hi, I'm Scott Taylor, 7 News. Mr. Chairman, I want to go back to last year's budget, specifically with the police department, and I want to ask you this question. What is your reaction to DC police officers telling us the morale on the streets for patrol officers are at an all-time low, and they blame you and the city council for that and the $15 million in budget cuts?
Well, the union can say it's at an all-time low. I don't agree. And the union is very much upset with the accountability measures that not only have been recommended or put in place in the city, but also are talked about across the country. I think it's a little too quick. I might even say a bit of a cheap shot to just simply blame the city council. And I know that they chafe at a provision that I put into last year's police accountability bill that says that the police can't bargain discipline. But that's not that's not that's not the cause of problems that the police are complaining of now.
Okay, now one more question. Thank you for answering the questions. Do you think the DC Police Union makes a good point with a tweet that they put up in the last 24 hours? It says, "Welcome to Washington, DC, where violent crime permeates everything. It's a tragedy that elected officials won't let us do our jobs." That was a tweet from the union itself.
Yeah, I think that's a little unfortunate. I don't think they're doing their cause any good there. You know, the issue with violent crime, as horrible as it is in the city, we're also seeing nationally, and the causes of that are very complex. And we know that from decades of looking at crime going up and going down. It's very complex. And to simply blame it the way the police union is unfortunate, to be kind. It's not accurate. The police union should be looking at itself as it ought to be a partner with how do we reduce crime, instead of just arguing over whether they should, how they should be held accountable. And there's nothing wrong with being held accountable. I mean, I'm held accountable, and all of us are, and the police should be too, especially when they have the unique authority to deprive people of liberty or even of life. So I think they need to look at being a partner rather than simply complaining that they can't exist the way they have for the last decade. And I would add as well that some of what they're complaining about really is a result of national debate and not unique to Washington. And they need to recognize that as well.
Thank you.
A couple more questions from me. So I just wanted to check, is it unusual to allocate so much money toward bills that haven't gone through the full
No.
legislative process yet?
We've done that before. And I think that's actually very appropriate because, as you know, there's a lot of legislation we passed subject to appropriation. So we pass a bill like Birth to 3, as a matter of fact, and it's not funded. And everybody gets excited and it's not funded. Here, when we get to passing that police accountability bill, it will have already been funded. So that's a good thing. But also, the budget process, even though we have a Budget Support Act going through, is really not the best way for us to be legislating these complex bills. It'd be a little bit more deliberative, develop a legislative record specific to that bill, a more thorough and careful approach. That's the better way. And so funding it now and then passing the legislation later, I think actually is a very good way to get it done.
Thanks. And then can I get your opinion on Councilmember Allen's proposal to phase out school resource officers out of schools over the next few years?
There's a lot of demand. You may be interested in this since you're asking these questions. There's a lot of demand for defunding police. The council's not going that far. We're looking at decentering. That was the phrasing that the Police Reform Commission used. Decentering is looking at whether police need to be doing everything they are doing, and maybe the policing in our schools is a bit more than is necessary to ensure safety. So I expect that his proposal is going to go through the council. I'm not sure there'll even be any debate on it.
Do you have any thoughts on the timeline, whether that should be faster or slower in terms of what he's proposing?
I think it makes sense that the approach that he's recommending, which is to phase in this this transition. And in fact, if those who don't like it somehow turn out to be right, then by doing this carefully, we can adjust that transition.
And one more for me, thanks.
You can ask as many as you want.
I got a question actually from someone who's watching this who wondered how the budget helps Black and Latino residents who were affected by the pandemic, not with federal dollars, but specifically local and American Rescue Plan Act.
Well, American Rescue Plan Act was our federal dollars. So there are a number of ways, but some of them I mentioned already. There's overwhelmingly in Washington, D.C., low-income individuals are African Americans or minorities. And overwhelmingly what we saw with the pandemic is that the people who lost their jobs or had their jobs cut back were low income. It was the lower wage jobs that were hurt the most by the pandemic. So when we have provisions in here, such as $35 million for excluded workers, that's low income workers, that's helping minorities. And the initiative, the Access to Justice initiative I mentioned, I mean, that's entirely for low income individuals. The I remember my notes here. The question was about the pandemic. So when I look at something like baby bonds, that's a long-term strategy on wealth building. So that doesn't respond to that. What we're doing with education, I think even at short-term, long-term, that helps. We're really trying to put a lot of resources in to help with learning loss, which is disproportionately affecting low-income kids. Maybe that's not so much people who lost their jobs, but it does speak to low income and equity issues. The job training, maybe that's not short-term because that could take 1 to several years, but that's almost entirely for lower income individuals. I mean, I suppose there could be some wealthy people who want to get in the nursing pipeline, but I doubt it. I think that's going to be more lower income folks. So there are a lot of different strategies that are targeted that way.
Thanks.
Are there any other questions? So what I'm told is that if anyone wants to look at the budget documents, there are reports as well as the legislative measures themselves. They are accessible now at chairmanmendelson.com/circulation. So that's the web address to be able to pull up the documents. germanmendelsohn.com/circulation. If there are no other questions, thank you all. The meeting starts at 10 at noon tomorrow.